Hey there, good morning. So I'm really excited to have my guest, Clair Mellenthin, licensed clinical social worker and registered play therapist, join me today to talk about trends that we've noticed over the years as we've been working in the play therapy arena. And so Claire is she's a presenter, she's an author, she's been part of the Utah Association for Play Therapy board for years, really helping to expand play therapy in Utah, as well as presenting all over the world and in different places doing supervision as well. So welcome, Claire. I'm so excited you could join me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's just a pleasure.
Do you want to talk a little bit about like some of the things that you're doing, and then we'll get into our nerdy. I always call it nerding out because
it's my favorite thing in the world to do.
I know. I feel like if you get a play therapist talking about play therapy, it's hard to get us to stop.
I know. Well, and speaking of nerding out, COVID did crazy things to all of us, and mine, thought it was a great idea to go back to get my doctorate. So I am
Snap!
right in the middle of that. But the fun things that I'm doing, I'm teaming up with Dr. Jessica Stone and Dr. Robert Jason Grant this summer, and we are doing a 3-day retreat in Park City, Utah, a play therapy retreat.
That'll be so cool.
So excited for this.
That is, yeah. And it's beautiful up there. So those of you, if you want to take a trip this summer and you want to go somewhere awesome, that is the place to be. It's so beautiful up there.
Oh, and getting out of the heat, like it's still warm and like it's just like the perfect temperature in the summer where it's like beautiful nights and beautiful days. But the three of us actually we're just finishing up our third book together. That shall be coming out with Wiley.
That's exciting.
December, somewhere around then. So yeah, we're kind of making a little leap into general psychology with this book and talking about the impact of trauma from a systemic lens. And so looking at all the different facets of how trauma impacts us, we thought it was pretty timely with everything that we're going through in the world right now. So
yeah, that's awesome. That's really awesome. So tell us how you got started in play therapy and kind of I'm curious, what are some of the biggest shifts that you've seen in play therapy?
Yeah, we were just talking about it. I mean, both of us have been in the field for over 20 years, and it does age us a minute.
I know.
So I kind of stumbled into play therapy in my, in college and all of that, kind of growing up. I always knew I wanted to do something in psychology. And I was fascinated with forensic psychology. Like I wanted to be like Patricia Cornwell's character in the book, like be a mastermind, like criminal profiler, which now that I know myself, I'm like, I'm so glad that's not what I did. But part of, one of the classes I had to take was child psychotherapy. And that I had to do an internship that year as part of my undergraduate class, which I think is so cool. I wish more undergrads still did those kind of things. I don't think kids get the same opportunities anymore that we did. But I ended up interning at a place called the Children's Center that's here in Salt Lake City. And it was my first exposure to play therapy. It was my first exposure to really young kids having pretty significant emotional and behavioral and understanding, like really looking at how trauma impacts kids through my cute little naive 20-year-old self. Like I just hadn't really seen that. And then that started kind of me like, well, maybe I want to do child psychology. And I ended up going to Africa for about a month when I was 19. And that really changed the trajectory into more of a social work lens. But what I found, it was so interesting there. I mean, they would just kind of laugh at me and my sister because they're like, you're like the Pied Piper, and it's just like this trail of kids, like wherever you go. And we couldn't communicate except through singing and dancing and playing. And it's just being what I'm like the third oldest of 8 kids. So little kids and that kind of like chaos and spontaneity, like it's just kind of second nature. Like I didn't even think about it. And that really launched me into really wanting to work with children and families. It just like it speaks to me in a way. And I was really, lucky in graduate school to end up, my very first internship was doing play therapy with 3 to 5-year-olds. And I had just amazing mentors who just kind of threw me in and were there like every step of the way. And it just really like I look back on that road and like, you can just see like this pathway just, kind of blossoming. Like I'm just right where I'm supposed to be, I feel like.
That's awesome. And that's awesome you got that experience early on, learning about play therapy. So just a disclaimer to everybody. I have 2 dogs, and
I have 3.
I currently have my door closed. So one of the dogs is scratching at the door, right? Right. Let me in, Mom. Let me. So if you hear, the likelihood my husband will let them in as he's going off to work is pretty high. Then you'll hear this moaning and scratching in the background. So if you do hear any weird and odd, strange noises, my crazy dogs.
People in her basement.
Right.
Dogs, right?
Right. It's kind of like kids. Let me in. Let me in. Why is the door closed? Yep. Yeah.
So that. Like it doesn't matter like how old we get, right?
No. Yeah, I can hear Lily's like, Mom, what the heck?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So yeah, my first introduction was it was in the 1980s, and I was a special education teacher, and I taught kids with emotional problems. And this was, so I'm from Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. My family and I moved west. We live in Southern Nevada. We moved here almost 7 years ago, which is weird. It's weird. I always told people when they ask, what's it like? I'm like, well, it's like living in a foreign country where everybody speaks English. It's so, so different. But so I lived right outside Washington, D.C., and I was at Fairfax County. I was a special ed teacher. And back then in the 80s, we had these self-contained schools within a larger elementary school. So we had a part-time psychologist and a part-time social worker, and they found, this was like in 1986, they were doing this thing called play therapy, and they would have these blocks, and they would take kids from my class, and then they'd go do this play therapy thing, and then they would be so excited. I mean, so excited. They would come, do you want to see? I'm like, in my head, I'm like, okay. And then I would look, and they were like, look, see. And in my head, I'm like, what am I looking at? No, but they would be like, blah, 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 blah. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, I don't see it. But then I did a group with the school psychologist. And this was right around the time Bruno Bettelheim's book, The Uses of Enchantment, came out. And the school psychologist, then we co-facilitated a group using fairy tale. And it was kind of like drama group therapy, and the kids would play out the characters. In every good fairy tale, there's an evil person. And so I always got assigned the evil person. And so I played my part well, man. I died well. I got killed off. Like, I can't even tell you how many times. What struck me, because I was a teacher, like that's kind of like the parent role, and you're the one that holds all the boundaries. The kids had emotional problems, so they always getting dysregulated. I saw such a difference in their interaction with each other and their interaction with me after we did these play therapy groups. And I thought, this counseling thing, I'd never heard of this counseling thing, but it seems kind of cool. And I realized I didn't want to do the teaching. I wanted to do this counseling thing. So I went back to school, got my master's degree, but it was another 10 years before the internet, before I could actually find somebody that knew what they were doing. And I think back then, that was the early 2000s. So play therapy, I think over the last couple of decades has gone through a lot of growth over the years. And when you think about it, the Association for Play Therapy here in the US got started in the early 1980s, which this is what blows my mind, because in my mind, I'm like, well, that's right around the time I got introduced to it, which kind of makes me think like it wasn't really well known there. And somehow these two professionals, mental health professionals, had found out about it, and they were starting to do it right at the very beginning. And back then, my guess is they were doing child-centered play therapy just based on the description. But, I'm curious for you, what have you noticed over the last 20 years as far as shifts and changes in the play therapy field?
Yeah, I'm like, wow, just even thinking back, I mean, so much has stayed the same and so much is different, and like I think from like that long-term view, I mean, because it's easy to look at like, holy cow, look at all the changes that have taken place in the last 3 years or the last 5 years.
Yeah.
But I think that, one of the things that I really appreciate in looking at the changes, I think child-centered play therapy has so much value, and I really believe it should be a foundational tool for everybody to learn how to be present and with like that between and within the relationship is so crucial, and to know how to do that. And that approach isn't going to work for everybody. And I think one of the greatest things that have come, in the last couple of decades is just the understanding that there's not one right way to do this. And we have different, theoretical approaches, and we have different theory models. And, I think really prior to like the mid 90s, there wasn't a lot. I mean, there was a lot of conflict within like when you talk to people about the history of APT and the together of the minds, there's definitely strong opinions about what is play therapy and how do we define this and what model is the right one. But I think that, like at least in my experience and exposure with this, I think that there's been an unfolding process that has happened. And that's one of the things I really love about this up and coming generation of play therapists is, challenging the status quo, I think, is a really hard thing, and it's a good thing to do. I mean, that's how all of us continue to grow. And I think looking for, different ways of engaging and being mindful about different populations who need different things. I mean, you think about like Robert Jason Grant, for example, like when he came online and talking about like, hey, we've got to look at neurodivergency and autistic kids in a different lens. That was met with a lot of skepticism,
That's interesting.
Still there's so much pushback.
Oh, interesting. I have neurodiverse kids, so that's
right.
always been my big thing, is really educating yourself about like ADHD and giftedness and sensory processing and autism.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I think just, from that global perspective, like I think play therapists have always known play therapy works, but the rest of the world hasn't. And it really hasn't been until like the last decade, especially, I think, when we finally had like the SAMHSA designation of like being like an evidence-based model.
Yeah.
And even now, I mean, that's a fight that continuously happens of like, what is the legitimacy of this field when people aren't familiar with play therapy? And there's still people and companies, insurance companies and mental health boards and stuff that question the validity of like why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that that's been such a beautiful thing, as I think as a field, we've been finding our voice and being able to say why play therapy works and how it works and the magic of this. And it's not just playing Barbies for an hour and calling it good,
Oh, I know. It kind of drives me crazy. I'm not going to lie. And I get it. At the same time, you know, I think that's a really good point, because it's an investment. It's an investment of time, and it's an investment of money to get that specialization,
Yeah.
because it's training, it's consultation, it's direct practice. And I remember I think it was around 2010, might have been a little before that. 'Cause I think I was in the play therapy, what was that? Leadership Academy,
Mhm.
at the time, and back then it was Bill Burns, and I think it was him. I remember them talking about they were the Association for Play Therapy was beginning to notice this thing called evidence-based practice and research, and how that research was gonna, um, for lack of a better way of saying it, legitimize the field. And so that out of that came the Play Therapy Foundation, which is the 501c3 part, the 501c3 part of Association for Play Therapy, for promotion of research. And I think since there's been a big push by the Association for Play Therapy for that research, I'm sure outside of the US, there's a lot of work being done as well. I'm not as familiar with that as I am with what the Association for Play Therapy has been doing over the last 20 years. But I think that has helped a lot to demonstrate the validity of the field through that research. And I think that played a big part in that evidence-based designation for some of the seminal theories in play
Yeah.
therapy.
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think, I just think that when we can continue to fine tune what we're doing and really understand why we're doing what we're doing, I mean, that is it's so important to not only be confident in your skills, but to develop competency in your, really building that strong foundation and a theoretical knowledge. And I mean, I know people who listen to me, they're like, this is such your soapbox. I'm like, I know.
That's right.
But I mean, that's really that's why the three of us are doing the retreat in August. The whole point of that is to understand integrating and interweaving theory and techniques. And you can't just open up a book and be like, I'm going to do this one today and let's see how it goes. I think that that's where such well-intentioned people unintentionally cause harm.
Right. I totally agree. And a few years ago, the Association for Play Therapy I think they reached out to some of the play therapists in the field to do, they called it a Delphi study. And that's where they came up with those 3 categories of competencies. And as supervisors, that, and I think this is really important as play therapy supervisors, like you said, one of our roles is to help the people that we're working with develop those core competencies, but also know what they are.
Yeah.
What those core competencies are, because like you said, it's not about pulling out games and toys. And I mean, I hear it all the time too. And in my head, I'm like, don't be mean. Don't show don't show that face, Kathy
You're
Spoon.
nice face on.
Rein it in, girl, because that's rude. But in my head, I'm like, oh, that's not even ethical, really. You really need the training. But I was that person for a long time because I couldn't find the training. Like back in the early 90s, there was no internet, and I had nowhere. I didn't know where and it felt awful. Because I had seen it, I had done it. Somebody else was facilitating it, but I didn't know how to do it, and it felt horrible. Like I felt like a fraud all the time. So there is a big difference. And I don't think you understand the difference really unless you have done the training and invested the time and resources into learning play therapy and, like, why is it different?
Yeah. No, without Phil, that's actually like wherever I'm speaking, across the world, that's like kind of one of my introductory questions of like, okay, I raise the hands. How many of you have heard about play therapy? And several hands go up. How many of you have been trained in play therapy? Multiple hands go down. How many of you, it's so interesting. How many of you practice play therapy? I asked that before being trained in play therapy. And it's always a fascinating thing. But I think that, this is also one of the changes, especially since COVID. I think that there is, speaking to exactly what you're talking about, there are so many areas of lack of accessibility in our country, and I think that that's been one of the really important changes that have happened, is being able to access trainings online, and affordably, and I know that there's a huge push, and a big debate about this, and how do we train effectively online versus in person. But I think that, speaking to exactly what you're saying, like, this is something that, as much as it's been a hard change, I think for a lot of people, we really have to be looking at this through an accessibility lens, and I think not only just, spatial accessibility, but financial, and making sure that we're presenting with a neurodiverse, lens on, of reaching, lots of different practitioners, with working with lots of different populations, and, really increasing like our diversity in the field, I think is something that is so crucial and so important. And part of this is really bringing accessibility to trainings. And I think, allowing, one of like the cool things, I think, especially from COVID, that has happened, is there's so many more opportunities for trainers to have a platform, instead of waiting for the APT conference or knowing the right people to speak in the state level conference. I mean, like,
Right.
there are some politics always involved in everything. I mean, that's part of human nature in organizations. And I think that that's been, with the rise and accessibility of the internet, especially in the last couple of years, when we figured out like, oh, you can actually do therapy online. Jesse was right. Who knew? Like, digital play therapy works. What? And but so does online training. I mean, is it the same as sitting in a room full of people? No. For some people, that's actually better. For others, it's like the very worst thing, and you're like, I want to pull my eyeballs out because I cannot sit in my chair and look at my screen any longer. But I think that because there's such a variety now, and that part of changing some of the APT requirements become RPTs, and allowing for, webinars and digital platforms to count and exist as part of the training. I think that that's been such a good shift in what we're doing. It's huge.
Yeah, I definitely think that's one of the more recent interesting trends is, excuse me, let me let my dog. I don't know if you guys can hear, but she is so loud.
It's good. I totally understand.
So loud, like, I feel like if she makes me interrupt and open the door, then she should make an appearance.
Exactly. Hi, buddy.
Yeah, that's Lily. She's made this before. So my other dog, Luna, is in the background.
She's like, let me in too.
She's we call her our neurodiverse anxious dog.
Yes.
Like,
I have a neurotic one myself.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, I think the whole ability, I always laugh too, because typically the vast majority of mental health professionals, and I'll say play therapists, I don't know, maybe the younger generation, but my generation were like, you want us to do what online?
Mm-hmm.
Like, technology and therapy? Like, how do you even do that? But I feel like our growth over I always say, well, I'm like forging new neural pathways to stave off dementia in my later years. Just that whole learning curve of live webinars. And I agree, like that accessibility, especially like I live here in Nevada, and Nevada just in the last year was able to get an Association for Play Therapy branch going. And
I remember when the first one ended. Yeah.
Oh, do you? Interesting. Yeah.
I've been in the field for a long, long time. Yeah. So I was on the board of directors at UAPT when they decided to close their chapter.
Yeah. And
I mean, back then we didn't have Zoom and platforms to connect. I mean, it was just too big and too hard and too spread out. And
yeah, because I always say, like, between Las Vegas and Reno, there's a whole lot of nothing.
Right.
And I'm sure it's, I've traveled through Utah too. There's a lot of rural areas. I lived in Virginia. There's a lot of rural areas in Virginia as well. So these rural areas being able to have access, I think has been a benefit for the profession doing the live webinars. I do a lot of live webinars, and I've attended a lot of live webinars. I kind of like them. I like the in-person too, but it's so much more comfortable to have my sweatpants on and a nice shirt with my slippers.
I have my PJ pants this morning,
My husband calls it my Zoom outfit. Is that your training outfit? I'm like, yep. Yeah. It's comfy.
I kind of would laugh with that. I'm like, it's kind of like I'm a walking mullet, right? Like
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And even like, I think that's, in my mind, that's kind of the next big trend. One of them, I think there's, like you said, that I call it like the second generation of play therapy field. So there's two things. One is, how are we going to do teletherapy? That like teletherapy is here to stay. So for play therapy, what does that look like? And I do think it's important to kind of figure out what are some of the best practices of that. What are some things that you have to think about? Are there any limitations as far as like age? And, I think we're figuring that out. And the other big trend, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, which is I feel like we're in the next generation of theory, meaning we've got our seminal theories, and now there's a lot more figuring out, well, one size really doesn't fit all. And so what does that look like? And back probably when you and I got started, like my default is child-centered play therapy. So that's my first. And I always say it doesn't work for everybody. Like the older the kids get, they're irritated. Like child-centered with a 10-year-old, they're usually yelling at me like, why are you talking funny? Stop it. Like, okay. And then I track that and I get the face. So, I think you and I both have a love of neuroscience and attachment, which I think is such a great way to integrate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And such a crucial part. I mean, I think that, that's been something, I mean, we've had both of us, like, this is like our passion of especially looking at that attachment in the family and really looking beyond just the individual child. I mean, we have got to be taking a systemic lens in our clinical work, because you cannot work with a 5-year-old in isolation. You can't work with a 10-year-old in isolation, let alone, any other age of client. Like, their world comes with them, whether we want it to or not. And I think
the same thing. Yeah.
Like, if we are not, it just boggles my mind. And I know that, I've had lots of conversations over many years about this, but it's like, we cannot expect a 5-year-old to be the change agent in the family system. Like, that is an unrealistic expectation to give to the least powerful, most vulnerable person in there.
Yeah, 100% agree. And yeah, that's one of the reasons why, like several years ago, that's probably like 10 now. I came up because being an attachment person, there weren't very many attachment models for integrating parents or family. Eliana Gill was one of the first ones to do play therapy. Well,
To write
well
about,
known, yeah.
yeah.
And so I took her training because she's from where she had her program where I was living at the time. But then I fell in love with attachment. So one of the things that I regularly do is use my attachment focused family play therapy and get them all in there, which is really funny because and I'm sure you probably find the same thing. But when I talk about, people that are doing consultation with me, and I'll say, what would be great? What would be great is to get the whole family in there. How cool would that be? And then they look at me with this look of fear on their face, like, you want me to do what? No. But then they do it and they're like, oh, okay. When you get everybody in there, you can see. And I'm not a one size fits all person. And if I have to use a manual, I'm terrible at manualized. To me, it's like so constraining. I see the benefit of it for sure. But that, one size doesn't fit everybody. And that doesn't work for me. So being able to have the flexibility to have it just child and parent, and then have the whole family in there and use play therapy to see what's going on, and then teach parents an attachment-based approach that they can practice in the play therapy sessions. It's really, it's amazing for sure. Yeah, I totally agree with that about looking at children systemically.
Yeah. And it's such a fun process once you like jump in and stop fighting against the current. I mean, I think that's like, I had an interesting supervision, just recently when we were talking about like, my supervisor made a comment like, okay, so I just have to stand up to the parent. I'm like, well, having boundaries is different. I'm like, but do you hear the language like the defense already put in place there? I'm like, that's different than having a clear boundary.
Right.
And what does that mean for joining with the parent and being, their partner in play, and it just was such a good conversation, and just kind of reframing, I think, some of that inherent bias. I think most play therapists, most child therapists have a natural gift and love for working with the children.
Right.
It's bringing in all the other players, that impact the child's world. And that's the part I think where like it's normal and natural to have some resistance and fear and, definitely feeling of insecurity, especially when you start, you first start doing that. But
right. Yeah.
It's so cool what a game changer it is for everybody.
Oh, it's yeah, agreed. And to me, I think that's been one of my biggest, what's the right word? Like areas of concern, because, I'm sure you were the same when we went through our play therapy training and consultation. It was just kids. You didn't really do much with the adult. But in my master's program for social work, mine was all family systems. Like I remember in graduate school, the first year, your foundation year in social work, you have to learn the different theories. And I remember learning about this thing called family therapy. And I was like a new born again person who has found Jesus. Like we're going out telling everybody. I'm like, I found family systems theory. I was like so annoying that I was like telling everybody. And I'm like, this family systems thing, like a new convert, right? But in my program at the time, our concentration year, or we called it specialization year, you could do either child and family welfare track or individual mental health. And so I chose child and family, which was all family systems.
Yeah.
all family systems. And so one of the things that so going through play therapy training and just being individual oriented, I kind of stepped away from my systemic roots, and then really began to notice, if I got to figure out what to do with the parents, like this does not feel right to me. And so really working on, one, figuring out what my expectations are. What is that going to look like? Even now I'm regularly saying, because they'll say, oh, I had the parent in the room. And in my mind, I'm like, awesome. What's the reason? Like, what's the parent's role in there? It can't just be to sit in there so that the parent's feeling comfortable. That's not the point. There needs to, what is your, when you're doing your case conceptualization, and that's my other nerdy area, case conceptualization drives your treatment planning. So what is it? How are you conceptualizing what's going on? Because then you're going to use that for your plan. And your plan is like your GPS that gets you through all of the phases of treatment. And so agree, like when you're doing your case conceptualization, you got to figure out their system. And what role is the system going to have in the treatment process?
Absolutely. You and I speak the same language. I'm like, that's exactly what I do in mine too.
Yeah, exactly. And trauma therapy, that attachment approach, using neuroscience and attachment, children, I always say, and I'm sure you probably say the same thing, children heal best within relationship with their most important people.
Yep.
Like, we're relational beings at our DNA. I don't know if that's scientifically correct, but it sounds good.
Actually, it is. If you talk with like Steve Parties and
at the DNA level,
maybe not the DNA level, but when we have like epigenetics, we do know that there is truth to that, right? And we know this intergenerational transmission of trauma happens when unresolved relational trauma in particular,
right, exactly,
isn't repaired and continues to persist. I mean, it does change your DNA, and so does healing, right. And I think that that's like one of the coolest things that we're finding, in research. I love nerding out on this. But, I mean, that's when you're working, this is especially, like at any point you can't work with a child in isolation, but especially when you're working with a traumatized kiddo, like our brains are wired, and the first thing we're looking for is, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe?
Right. Yep.
And if we're only maximizing the attachment to us, and then treatment ends and they're on their own again, like, we actually have done a disservice to this child.
I say the same thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I totally 100%. You and I could probably talk about that topic for probably a good 2
hours. Forever. It's my favorite thing.
We're on the same soapboxes, man. Yeah. So let me wrap up. And why don't will you tell people about your awesome retreat type training in Park City? And then if for people are interested in the retreat, there's a link in the description for this episode. There's also a link to Claire's website as well as the registration link. So do you want to tell us about the training and when it is? And
and thanks for talking about it. I'm like, I really am so excited about this. So it's the first weekend in August. I think it's August. Is that 4th? I'm like, I always need to look at my calendar. I think
it's the 3rd through the 5th. Not that I've been looking.
Yes.
Where to go.
I'm like, I'm gonna go that first weekend. I should know, but we're doing an all-inclusive, like, top of the line resort. Like, we're staying at the Grand Hotel in the Canyons Resort. It's all inclusive. So in the registration price, it's all the meals, all the supplies, all the training hours, like everything is included at top of the line, beautiful setting. The only thing that's not included is dinner, because everybody needs a break from each other. That's just being honest, right? Like, we need connection and we need separation, right? And some people, after a day of training, they're like, I can't look at another person. And
Yeah.
other people are like, let's go to dinner, let's go play, you know?
Yeah. That's kind of
Um,
how I am. I need to like get my brain to stop.
right. And so we wanted to just really be mindful of what different needs are. And so, you know, part of this is we want to build in tons of self-care. And so, like, it just, the amenities are just so awesome there. It's so beautiful. But the training aspect is we're looking at, again, taking a systemic view of this. So we're integrating, talking about different theoretical models, how we integrate this into work with individuals, with families, with groups. And then how do we bring this back into our practice settings and make the world a better place? You know, that we'll be incorporating a lot of hands-on experiential learning, meaning we're not doing lecture the whole time, but I mean, we really are staying in one of the most beautiful places. We're going to be using nature a ton, getting outside a ton, bringing in the elements in our work. And, you know, people hopefully will leave just rejuvenated and ready to take on the world and have like a whole new toolbox of not only techniques, but feeling confident and competent in what we're doing. And so I'm so excited. The early bird special is, I think, through the end of May. I think it ends May 31st. There's also a group discount. So if you join up with 5 of your friends, I think it's like 20% off. Like, it's a nice discount. Yeah. And spots are filling up quick. So
that's awesome.
It's
cool.
Gonna be so fun. And really, like, I, of course, am biased because I love Jesse and Robert. They're some of like my very best friends on this planet. And we have so much fun together. But I think, you know, a lot of people are like, how are the 3 of you doing a training? Because you guys are so different in your expertise. And I love that's like, nice. Exactly, like this, again, this interweaving and intersectionality in the presentations and the presenters too, you know. And so we'll be talking about how do we incorporate and integrate in digital play therapy? How do we bring in attachment? How do we bring in not play? You know, like all of these different interweavings coming in. So I'm so excited for it. It's going to be just a riot. And hopefully, you know, you'll learn things too.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So we're going to wrap up. So if you're interested in the training that Claire's talking about, honestly, feel free to hop over there, check out the link, take advantage of that early bird pricing for sure, if you can. Yeah. Also, if you found this episode helpful, please like and share it across your social media. I live stream every week into my private Facebook group, Playing Expressive Arts Therapy. That's for child and adolescent therapists who are using play therapy and expressive arts. So if you're interested in the group, you can pop over there, Play and Expressive Arts Therapy Playground. But you do have to answer all the questions. Sometimes I always say that people don't answer all the questions, and I feel really bad that people don't get in. But so that's why I keep saying it. And so LinkedIn, my YouTube channel, all of the live replays are over there on the YouTube channel. You click on the live episode, so it's easy to share that way as well. And if you're interested, I have a Play Therapy Academy. It's group consultation. There's also core foundational play therapy trainings in that Play Therapy Academy. So if you're interested in that, I will post a link in the comments. You can always, I also have this fancy schmancy banner that goes across the bottom of the screen, man. So that's my website, Play Therapy Academy, and another course that I have. Also, feel free to go over there, hop on and check out that training. Or if you're interested in supervision with Claire, you can kind of talk with her about that as well. Check out her books, all that kind of fun stuff. All righty. I'll see you guys. We'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kathy.